because that's where they got to and couldn't get any farther. You know, we will look at it and we'll say, oh, what's it all about? I mean, it's a difficult book. I mean, the concepts in it aren't that difficult. I mean, it's really simple to read and say, you know, you sacrifice an animal here, sacrifice, you know, grain offerings here. Don't allow mildew in your house here. Things like, I mean, the concepts aren't difficult, but it gets difficult when we try to figure out what it means to us, because it can seem to us in this day and age pointless and irrelevant, incredibly out of date. Maybe it's meaningful in an ancient time, you know, we can see that. But to people today, it hardly seems relevant at all. This can make it very difficult to read because, you know, let's be honest, it can seem really boring. I'm being honest here. Maybe you've experienced that. Leviticus is filled with detailed instructions on various types of sacrifices and offerings and how you're to do it, and the most minute details that you don't want to know. I mean, if they were to make a movie out of the stuff that they're doing and some of these offerings and the detail, it would be really unpleasant to watch. You know, how to do them, what parts you can eat, what you do with the various parts, on and on and on. I mean, why do we care about animal sacrifices today? Do we? And I think that if we thought that we had to do them in order to be obedient to God and the Bible, I think we'd all just walk out right now. Suddenly I tried to say, we need to do animal sacrifices. You'd leave. Leviticus is also filled with detailed regulations on some very, very strange things. You know, at least seemingly strange from at least a religious point of view. I mean, why is it a religious matter whether or not we eat owls or crickets or camels? I mean, how is that a religious matter? I mean, we don't like mildew or infectious skin diseases, but how are these matters of religion? Rules about tattoos, trimming your beard, selling your daughter into prostitution, sex with relatives, harvesting grapes, fabric made with more than one kind of material. More. What's it all about? And honestly, who cares? Who cares? In 2007, A.J. Jacobs published a book called The Year of Living Biblically. Maybe you've heard of it. Where he tried to live by the Bible as literally as he possibly could. Can you imagine? And he had the Old Testament in mind. Is this what God wants from us? To be obedient to the Bible, do we have to follow all the rules and regulations that we find in Leviticus? Should we be setting up an altar for animal sacrifices here in the sanctuary? Well, if not, how can we be so selective with the Bible? If one part no longer applies, then why does the rest still apply? You know, how do we deal with this? And I mean, was Jesus talking about Leviticus when he said, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them"? If he was, what did he mean? Is it possible to read Leviticus without being bored to death? Reading Leviticus really, though, quite honestly, can be a very, very powerful experience when we understand it. I remember one time I sat and I read it straight through. And I remember the word that came out of my mouth when I was finished. It was a very simple word. That word was, wow. How could it be? Wow. But to understand it, we need to frame it really with two other pieces from the Bible. Because these bookends, these frames, these things that surround it give us a way to look at it. The first one is something that I mentioned last week, It has to do with Moses following the golden calf incident, and God is telling the people he'd no longer be present with them. And Moses comes to God, and and he's talking to God, and he says to him, one of the things he pleads with God was for this. He says, "If you're pleased with me, teach me your ways, so I may know you and continue to find favor with you." That's the beginning frame. And the second, the end frame, is what Jesus said that I just quoted a minute ago. "Do not think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." When we see those two things as a way of interpreting the whole book and understanding the whole book of Leviticus, the meaning can suddenly start to take form. Now, some of the detail gets pretty significant here. Someone has called Leviticus a manual for Jewish priests because it gives really detailed instructions, but it's not just for priests, it's to understand exactly what was expected. So, that when you're reading it, when you're understanding the law, you knew exactly what the priests were doing with your offering because you weren't ever going to see it happen. One way we know it's not just for Jewish priests. Do you know that Jewish children, at least in the past, I don't know if they still do, but Jewish children used to start memorizing the book of Leviticus at age 3? Can you imagine? It was so important to them that from age 3, children started to memorize it. Would you like to do that? Of all the parts of the Bible you get to memorize, Leviticus. Sound exciting? I don't think so. Much of what's described goes into great detail about how certain ceremonies and rituals are to be conducted. But this is a reminder that they're given by God. These are not human regulations. These are not man-made regulations. And it tells us that how we worship, what we do, actually matters. That worship is something that God designs, not us. And we do need to worship God His way, not our way. Now, again, Jesus came to fulfill the law, so we're not going to be worshiping that way. But when Jesus says that He wants worshipers, the Father wants worshipers who will worship Him in spirit and in truth, the very idea is carried over that we worship God's way, not our way. So we're going to spend 2, maybe 3 weeks. We're going to look at the whole book of Leviticus. I'm not going to go into detail. There's so much detail. I'm not going to tell you all about every rule and regulation. But I want to just give you some ideas on how, when you read it, some of the things to actually look at and look for to understand the bigger picture, so that you can see how this whole thing fits into the whole Scripture, the whole of the fantastic journey that the Bible is from beginning to end. The first thing that, when we read this, we got to come from the point of view that we just said, where Moses was, that we're separated from God. We're separated by our sin. And that goes right back to the beginning in Genesis, and the story of the fall of Adam and Eve. Their sin separated them from God. And then it was re-emphasized just a few chapters ago in Exodus, when God said that He would not go with Israel into the promised land. He would not be present with them. So we have to come at this whole thing from an understanding that we are by nature and by sin separated from God. And when we understand that, we can understand that coming into God's presence, being allowed into the presence of God, is a privilege, and it is not a right. It is not our right to come to God, but it is a God-given privilege. And that's where the first 7 chapters deal with sacrifices and offerings. And it talks about if you want to bring an offering and various types of offerings, this is how it's done. This is how it's done. Now, when we come to God with offerings, it's recognizing something. It's recognizing that there is a cost to sin. Sin actually costs something. It has an effect on us. And there's a price that needs to be paid. Reconciliation by offering, which was talked about in those first 7 chapters, recognizes that cost. We don't come into the presence of God empty-handed as if it's no big deal. I mean, how many of you, when you go to visit a friend, particularly if it's somebody you haven't seen for a while, you get invited for dinner, you go over and maybe you bring some flowers, you bring, you want to bring something, right? It's a token of your appreciation. Well, how much more is it so that when we come into the presence of God, we come bearing something, recognizing in part our unworthiness, recognizing the cost of sin, recognizing the privilege that God has granted to us. Even when we take up our collection on Sundays, it's not the same thing as an animal sacrifice, thankfully. But we don't take up an offering for the purpose so that we can pay the bills. That's not what it's about. And it's important that we all understand that. Yes, of course, we use the offerings to pay the bills. But that's not what it's about. That's what we do with it, but that's not what you do with it. When you come before God with your offering, it is very literally an act of worship, recognizing the privileges that it is to come into God's presence. I've often thought that I would like to get rid of the collection plates. Stop passing the plate around. And say to you that when you come in, what I want you to do is I want you to come, I want you to take your offering, and I want you to lay it down on the table. A very conscious thing for you to do, where you take the effort and lay it before God. Because the similarity between doing it that way and what it was in ancient times to actually carry in the offering and lay it before God, it is an act of worship, of laying it before and laying your gift on the altar. Maybe we should try that. What do you think? It's an act of worship. And laying it before Him recognizes that. But it also recognizes not just that it's not that it is a cost of sin, but there's a result. Sin has a result. The Bible, most of us know, says that the wages of sin is death. Sin means death. That's what God said to Adam and Eve. You eat from the tree, you die. Right? And it's been true. That's been a truth since the beginning. And the wages of sin is death. There are no small sins, there are no big sins. We talked about that in our class this morning. That doesn't seem right. If I killed somebody, that seems a whole lot bigger sin than going into the dollar store and stealing a chocolate bar. Right? So why do we say that there's no big sins and small sins? Well, because if I kill you, that's a big sin against you. And if I steal your chocolate bar, that's a small sin against you. But David said in Psalm 51, against you, Lord, and only you have I sinned. Now it's true, if I kill you, I've sinned against you. If I steal your chocolate bar, I've sinned against you. But against God, it's a whole different sin. I haven't killed God. I haven't stolen God's chocolate bar. The same sin in both cases is that I've rebelled against God. I've rebelled against His authority. I've rebelled against His righteousness. I've rebelled against His holiness. I've rebelled against His claim on my life. And it doesn't matter what it is, I've rebelled, and it's the same sin, and all rebellion is the same. But the sacrifices recognize the cost, the result that is death, and God has provided a way that the death that we deserve from our sin gets transferred onto that poor, unfortunate, and innocent animal. Doesn't seem very fair, doesn't seem very right. How in the world can a sheep dying on an altar take away my sin? We'll get there in a minute. But for me to take my offering is for me also to take responsibility for my sin. To recognize that I did it. and I am responsible. It's interesting, in Leviticus 5:17, there's an interesting verse there. It says, if anyone sins and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, even though they do not know it, they are guilty and will be held responsible. You don't have to know that you've done wrong to be responsible for the wrong that you've done. You're still guilty. It's interesting that the passage we read from 2 Samuel, it's interesting where it cut off. Because it emphasized the worship and the praise that was going on as they were moving the Ark of the Covenant. But something happened right afterwards. It stopped at verse 5, but as soon as we get to verse 6 and verse 7, we read that the oxen that were pulling the cart stumbled, the cart was about to tip, the Ark of the Covenant was about to fall off and land on the ground. This is the most sacred object in all of Israel. And Uzzah, son of Abinadab, he does the natural thing that any one of us would do. He reaches out and he takes hold of the Ark of the Covenant so that it doesn't fall. He protects it. God gets angry and kills him for that. What? You see, he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. He thought he was doing something right. How many times have we thought we were doing the right thing? Or we didn't mean to do something wrong? Uzzah violated God's holiness and holiness by touching such a sacred object. I'm so thankful things don't work that way anymore. Didn't matter whether we know it or not. We're responsible for our sin. It doesn't have to be deliberate. And taking the offerings recognizes we're taking responsibility for our sin, whatever it may be. And recognizing that no matter what, we're sinners before God. Now, Jesus said he came to fulfill the law. How does Jesus fulfill any of this? Prophet Isaiah, a few hundred years later, wrote this, talking about Israel. And all they've been doing, all these sacrifices for all these years, generations. And he says, the multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me? I've had more than enough of burnt offerings, of rams, and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. He says, you've been keeping those laws, you've been making those sacrifices, and he says, you know what? They're not doing anything for me. I've had enough. In Hebrews, it goes on and expands that and says, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. In other words, those sacrifices may mean that we have to take responsibility for our sin. It may recognize the cost of sin. It may recognize that sin leads to death, but it doesn't take away sin. Jesus comes because he replaces those ineffective sacrifices by becoming the sacrifice that does take away sin. All those sacrifices simply pointed to the need for a Savior who actually worked. And when Jesus died on the cross, forgiveness of sin was ours. Everything that all those sacrifices pointed to came to fulfillment in Jesus. They weren't meant to take away sin. They were meant to point us to our wonderful Savior, Jesus Christ, who is the necessary and sufficient sacrifice. Now, that's the offering. From there it goes on and it starts talking about the priests, Aaron and his sons, and all the things that they had to do to prepare themselves to come into the presence of God. You know, when we come into the presence of God, we learn from the priests that just as it was not our right to come to the presence of God, but it's a privilege, but that we need to prepare ourselves to come into the presence of God. You know, the door to God's presence is not open to just anyone and everyone. We're not used to that thought. We've come to think that God he just has this great big wide open door and says, everyone come to me. And there's a truth to that, because God's invitation is to everyone. But as you read even through the New Testament, you look at Jesus, Jesus says he invites everyone, but not everyone gets in. Why is that? Because God is holy. And this is a concept that I can't even wrap my head around exactly what that means. That God is separate from everything, absolutely everything, that is unclean, impure, imperfect, less than what it was meant to be. And we, too, in order to come into the presence of God, have to be holy. Now, the priests, they did it through various washings, and they wore special clothing, but again, that was all symbolic. And for them, they were doing it as representatives of the people. We've talked about that before. Because it was impossible for everyone to do all this and be holy. So the priests went through this enormous ritual, and they became our mediators. They became our representatives in the presence of God. That separation was still not overcome. And even then, they weren't really in the presence of God. Remember Moses, we just talked about this. Moses said, God, show me your glory. And God said, I would love to, but I'll let you see my back, but you cannot see my face. Let's talk about that last week. Because the day is not yet. But one day the Bible tells us we will see him face to face. But now, people had the priests who would represent them. Because that sin, that gap, was too great. Now, talking about the idea that not just anyone and everyone can come into the presence of God, what happens when we presumptuously try to come into the presence of God when we're not fit, when we're not ready, when we're not prepared? You get into Leviticus chapter 10, and chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, we read the story about two guys by the name of Nadab and Abihu. Great names, right? Sons of Aaron, the high priest. These were guys who were called by their inheritance to be priests of God. The Bible tells us this. It says, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, took their censers, that's the things that carry this fire, special fire, put fire in them, and added incense, and they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. So fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Nasty stuff. Nasty stuff. If we somehow were able to try to come into the presence of God unprepared, we would be consumed, so to speak, by fire. Like I said, no impure or unclean thing can be in the presence of God. And we ain't there yet. We ain't there yet. But then there's Jesus. Then there's Jesus. Jesus talks about how, the book of Hebrews talks about how Jesus is our high priest. Now we're going to talk about that probably next week. He's our high priest. Not Aaron anymore. Not an ordinary man, but Jesus becomes the high priest. He's the guy who's going to lead. He's the guy who's going to make all the real special and important sacrifices. And by Jesus taking over Aaron's role as high priest, something else happens. Is that we get a promotion too, if you like. Because in Exodus 19:6, God had said to Moses and the people that I will make you a kingdom of priests. All of God's people are intended ultimately to be priests of God. The priests of God are the ones who come into the presence of God. And we don't need to have all those mediators anymore. We end up with one mediator. The Bible tells us that there is one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. He fulfills that priestly role to the fullness so that all of us are able to come into the presence of God. But we have to recognize that preparation. We need to recognize that how important it is that we lay aside all the things that make us unclean and unfit and unworthy. That's why in Leviticus 10:10, God says this after this incident. He's talking to Moses and Aaron and the remaining sons, how they have to keep themselves fit. And he says this, he says, you must distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean. And you must teach the Israelites all the decrees of the Lord has given them through Moses. In other words, we have to know that there are things that are unworthy of being one of God's people, and we have to leave those things aside. We can't think that we can bring our sinfulness and say, I can keep this and come into the presence of God. We take our sinfulness and we give it to God so that He can take it away from us so that we can come into the presence of God. But if we think I'm just going to continue to sin and God's going to be happy with that, He's going to be okay with that, He's not going to worry about that, we're going to be like Nadab and Abihu, worshiping God in a way that's unworthy. And that's risky business. We move on from talking about the priests. We get into chapter 11, going 11 to 15. And this is where life gets really interesting in Leviticus. This is where we start to find some of the rules and the regulations. Talking about how we can be fit for God's presence. You know, that's what Moses was talking about when he asked God, teach me your ways. What do I have to do, God? What do I have to do? I don't think there's the picture there. I don't think I put it on there. I had a picture of workers in an Intel factory. Yeah, that's the one. These guys are working in an Intel microchip factory. You notice how they're dressed? Completely covered in sterile suits. Their mouths, their hair is covered. They're breathing through masks. They got gloves on. Why? Because this factory where the microchips are being made has to be sterile. No contaminants can come in. Why? Because they will mess up the work that's going on. And it's a picture, if you like, of the impact of the smallest little contaminant. And if that's true at a microchip factory, how much more true is it entering into the presence of God? But we can't enter the presence of God by wearing sterile suits and breathing masks. We need some greater cleanliness. Otherwise, God's presence could be infected. But we know that that's not going to happen. So we get various forms of uncleanness in these verses, chapters 11 through 15. Again, we're going to read these things and think, what? And it talks about unclean food and that there are the things that you can and cannot eat. And it talks about purification after childbirth and infectious skin diseases and mildew. I don't know, it doesn't quite seem terribly religious. But all these things, they're not clean, are they? But they're symbolic, really. They're external things. They're not about what's really going on inside of who we are. They're symbolic of our greater need for holiness and the need to live a holy life, to live separated from anything that's unclean. And the heart of the book of Leviticus is found in chapter 11, verse 44. the very essence of what Leviticus is all about. God says this, "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourself."